Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Fatigued by School Reform, a book talk with Jack Jennings. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. All attendees will be muted on this webinar. You can see the red microphone at the bottom and top right of your screen. To communicate with the speakers or host, enable the Q&A and chat functions by clicking the participant and chat bubble icons at the bottom of your screen. You can designate who sees your comment or question by selecting the recipient shown in the left two images. Please send any logistical questions or comments to host via the chat box, and send any questions to our speakers to all panelists via the Q&A box. Feel free to send in your questions to our speakers throughout the event, and we will try to get to as many as we can. For those of you on social media, feel free to join the conversation on Twitter. We will be using the hashtag #FatiguedByReform, and we encourage you to tweet at and follow the handles listed on the screen. Lastly, this event is being recorded. The event recording will be available on both Jack Jennings' website and AYPF's website shortly after the event. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to our moderator, Dr. Loretta Goodwin, to kick us off.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Fatigued by School Reform, a book talk with Jack Jennings. My name is Loretta Goodwin, and I'm the Deputy Director at the American Youth Policy Forum in Washington, D.C. In case you're not familiar with AYPF, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan convening organization, and we're based in D.C. and focused on education, workforce development, and youth development issues. We bring together diverse stakeholders to discuss and frame issues to better inform policy. And our ultimate goal is to improve the lives of young people, especially those who are traditionally underserved. We are very excited today to talk about Jack's new book. But first, a word about Jack. Jack Jennings is the former president and CEO for the Center on Education Policy, which is a Washington, D.C.-based nonpartisan nonprofit education research organization. From 1967 to 1994, he served as subcommittee staff director and then as a general counsel for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and Labor. After graduating from the Northwestern University School of Law and being sworn into the bar, Jack Jennings went to Washington, D.C. to begin what became a career in politics and education policy that has continued for more than 50 years. Today, Jack is going to tell us about his new book, Fatigued by School Reform, and our conversation will focus on the book's broader lessons around American K-12 education, economic opportunity, and teacher quality. Following Jack's presentation, we will get to your questions, and you can please submit them into the question box as we go along. Jack, before I turn things over to you, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and specifically how and why you ended up devoting most of your professional life to education policy.
Sponsoring this event, I appreciate it very much. I got involved in education through a circuitous route. When I was in law school, I got involved in politics in Chicago and through the Young Democrats, and I got to know a number of congressmen, including Rowman and Littlefield, who was my home congressman. And when I finished law school, Mr. Littlefield had just lost the bill in the House of Representatives, the first defeat by the Johnson administration in 1967. And so he asked me to come aboard on his subcommittee to head it, and he fired all the rest of the people. So I wound up with one or two people, and I had to learn how to be a subcommittee counsel because I was a lawyer for one day, and I was 24 years old. But once I got involved in it, I just loved the combination in Congress of having, you could be an advocate for policy for what you want changed, but you had to get it achieved through political means. And I didn't like politics alone because of raising money and things like that. I didn't like policy alone because it gets too abstract at universities and not real. But I like the idea of wrestling in Congress over policy because you're dealing with ideas and also you're dealing with politics. And so I just took to that, and that's the reason I was there. But in the process, I started off with education, and I decided to stay with education because schools are just essential in this country to continue a democracy, to have the type of society we want to have. And I felt I would spend my time trying to improve schools as best as they could be, but especially to look after kids who are left behind because of mental disabilities, because of poverty, because of other things. Those are the kids we're really neglecting in education. And so it's what I tried to do through all my years in policy is to keep a special eye out for opportunities to right that wrong and try to bring better opportunities to those kids. So that's how I got involved and how I stayed involved. Now, we can move on.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Thanks for sharing that with us. I'm now going to let you go ahead and share your book with us via your slides, and then I will be back at the end of that presentation to deal with the questions.
Excellent. Well, I got involved in this matter, this book, about 2 years ago. An old friend of mine said that he'd be willing to publish a book I wrote once we could agree on a topic. And a book is an enormous burden. It took me a year with this book. But the topic we agreed on was something that had been bothering me. I knew we had 50 years of school reform, 50 years to make the schools better from the 1960s to the present, and that there were scads of ways that people tried to make the schools better. And people were right intention, but it doesn't seem like these have made a massive change in the schools. And so I was especially bothered when I saw a poll, Phi-Delta Kappa poll a couple of years ago, that found that a majority of Americans think that the public schools are worse today than when they went to school. That's quite a condemnation, that they're worse today than they were a couple of years ago, even after all these attempts to bring about change. So what I wanted to do was look at these questions. The question that's asked in the next slide. The question is, why do the majority of Americans think schools today are worse than they were when they attended? And the question is asked by people, all sorts of people I meet. When we moved back to Chicago, people at Clare would ask me, why are the schools so bad? Is it the fault of the unions? Why aren't kids learning? How can we have such bad schools when taxes are so high? There are very few positive attitudes of public education. So I decided I had to tackle this somehow. And this was my plan, which is on the next slide. I decided after reviewing the Coleman report that we would use the Coleman report, and then we would look at the major reforms of 50 years, and then we would look at these reforms in light of the Coleman report. Now, the Coleman report is not as well known today as it was years ago. It's known better in education than outside education. But it has some very valuable concepts that will be useful for us to look at the major reforms. The one thing you should be aware of as we go into this discussion is that you should be aware of a phrase called socioeconomic status, SES. And this is what all the sociologists and other researchers use to shorthand that somebody's rich or somebody's poor. If you have a high SES, you're rich. If you have low SES, you're poor. And the way they determine SES is three factors. One is family income. The second is the occupational status, which is high prestigious job or not. And thirdly, how much education parents have. Those three factors put together determine whether a kid is going to do well in school or not. So we have to be aware of SES as we go through our discussion here. So I decided to look at these four reforms, and that's the next slide. Four major reforms I could find looking over 50 years. I mean, that's a hell of a lot of material, thousands and thousands of attempts. But the criterion I used was which reforms had the broadest impact on the schools. And what I came to was equity, which had a broad impact in the 60s to 70s when it was created. Standards and tests, these are academic standards, in the 1980s and 90s. Accountability, 2000, 2015. Choice, from 1992 till the present. Now, let me say a word about each of these reforms, and we'll start with equity on the next slide. Equity was very much a product of the 1960s. That's when I started in Washington in 1967, this naive young man. But I could tell that equity was in the air. That's what people wanted to act on. They wanted to end discrimination. They wanted to end poverty in the country. They wanted to provide means for people to get job training in order to do better in life. They wanted to make sure that poor kids got high-quality Head Start programs. All the ideals were in the 1960s. And the objective was to include the excluded, to include the poor, the handicapped, disabled, non-English speaking, and women. Because women at the time were facing discrimination in colleges. They were being blocked from getting professorships, and they were excluded to a large extent from sports. So this equity movement wanted to right the wrongs, and it set up the structures, but it didn't do the full job. And that was partially because Lyndon Johnson took the money that he was going to put in these programs and instead used it for the war in Vietnam. But at least they tried, and I used school finance reform as an example of that. School finance reform has led to fair distributions of funds within the state. It has not been able to do anything about the problem that state legislatures, especially under Republican control in the last 20 years, have underfunded education. So there's not much money there to do a good job. The money that is there is more fairly distributed. So you can see the inequities there. Well, so moving on to standards reform. Some of the critics of equity reform said that the doors of the schools were open to children with disabilities. They were open to children who didn't speak English. They were special services were provided to poor children. They said all this was done, but the kids still didn't know much more at the end. Now, I don't quite agree with that, but that was a common opinion, that these equity programs loosened the education standards. And so the standards movement developed, and it was primarily propelled by business people and governors. And the objective was to raise student achievement through higher goals. But 30 years ago, states did not have state academic standards. This is new for the United States. Everything was locally driven. And this is unlike every other industrialized country in the world. These other countries have an anchor. They have curriculum, or they have some set of standards that they use. We did not. Now, after this movement has been in effect for a while, after there's 2 federal laws to enforce it, every state has standards. And these standards are in at least 2 subject areas, English and math, and in frequently more subject areas. And what's happening now is that since the standards are in place, the content of the standards is being integrated into the various topics, math and science and so on. But it's taking a while because it has to be put into professional development, teacher training, and all these other things. So standards reform has been successful in laying the groundwork for what they want to do. We don't know the ultimate results. I think that standards reform has been captured by the next reform, which is accountability. The accountability reform came about with George W. Bush in 2000, the election in 2000. He took office, and the first bill he proposed was accountability. There's no child left behind. And he had bipartisan support from Senator Ted Kennedy. I can talk about that later. So this accountability statute was the strongest federal law that was ever enacted in education. And it was proposed by a conservative Republican governor, was endorsed by a liberal Democratic senator, and it received the overwhelming support of Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress. The Republicans and governors, business people, frequently fight against the federal government having a presence somewhere. Here, governors, in particular 4 governors, came to Washington, assumed office, and pushed through legislation that made the states do what they thought would help education. So it's an interesting approach that governors use federal law to influence themselves. So accountability is envisioned in No Child Left Behind. Has its ultimate goal increasing test scores of student achievement, as shown by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Well, the movement did not achieve that end. Test scores did not go up significantly. And so the goal was unachieved. And there's growing opposition to the way the program was operating. So what happened was that the program was repealed, and it was replaced by a weaker program. Am I still on?
Yeah.
Okay. The last reform we're going to look at is choice. Choice is a different bird. Choice is a market-based approach to education. And what choice says is that parents should be able to choose the school that their child wants, and that child will be better off by that choice. Well, there are three ways of bringing about choice. One is through tax deductions and tax credits, and this is in state tax codes as well as the federal tax code. And this makes money available to organizations that pay for tuition in private schools for children. The second way is vouchers. Vouchers were first provided in Milwaukee in 1992. Now there are a number of states that have statewide voucher programs. And the Supreme Court has said that vouchers are a constitutional way to provide money to schools. It's interesting, if the check goes through the parents to the school, it's constitutional. If it were to go straight to the school, it may not be constitutional. So they figured out a way to make vouchers constitutional. The last way of choice is in charter schools. And charter schools are semi-public, semi-private schools. They have fewer federal regulations. They frequently don't have unions. And what they do is they try to bring the best of public and private education together. Well, the premise behind both of those reforms, vouchers as well as charter schools, was that the private market was better than the public market, and that private schools were better than public schools. Well, if you look at the evaluations of both vouchers and charter schools, you'll find that there's no private school advantage. Namely, students of similar SES, similar circumstances, whether they're in public school or private school, do about the same. And so there's the premise of allowing private schools for vouchers, allowing charters, has not proven to be accurate. So here we are. We've looked over the four reforms. We find that choice is not fulfilled its promise, but it's popular otherwise because parents like the idea of picking out their school. That standards-based reform was successful, but then accountability came in, and accountability was not successful, although it did leave a residue in the minds of administrators that test scores are what counts. And equity never met its full potential. So let's go to the Coleman report. This will give us a different view of these four movements. First, Coleman was very famous for a point in time, for about 20 years, and then sort of slid off the popularity scale. Harvey, take some water. That's good, thank you. The Coleman report was written in 1966. It was a congressionally mandated report through the Civil Rights Act. And what Coleman was to investigate was whether there was discrimination against African American students in American schools. Well, he didn't need a report to report that. He affirmed it. But he had so much data. He collected slews of data from teachers, from students, from administrators. He had so much data that he wrote the first in-depth report on American public schools. He did this in an interesting way. He checked into a sort of a seedy motel in Washington, D.C., with a bottle of bourbon and with computer runs. And he put these computer runs up on the walls while he drank and studied them and studied them and studied them for a long time. And then he emerged with a report that I believe is about 600 pages of drafts and charts and all this, which lays out wonderful things to know. It's the attitudes of teachers, where spending is going, the effects of teacher training. It's just a plethora of information. But the main finding he had, or he drew from his data, was that the most important, most accurate indicator of whether a child is going to do well in school is the parental background of the parents of the student. And these are generalizations. They're not all true for all families at the high end. They're not all true for all families at the low end. But the generalizations are that when you look at social economic status, you're looking at the income of the parents, the educational level of the parents, and how esteemed their job is. And what they found, what Coleman found, was that if parents had education, had money, and had a good job, their kids were going to do better in school as a group, not individually, but as a group. At the other end of the scale, if a kid came to school with parents who didn't have a good education, didn't have much money, and didn't have a prestigious job, those kids were going to be at the bottom of the scale. Now, Coleman took that as a challenge, but he said American schools are not structured to make up for the disadvantages that kids have at the lower end. he's rather pessimistic on that. But he did think that these should not be findings where kids are condemned forever to where they are, but they should be a challenge to kids to do better than they can do. So that's what the Coleman report is. The second thing he found was that far behind parental background was teacher quality. Now, teacher quality was the most predominant predictive value in schools. Family background is out of school. So within school, teacher quality was the most important factor. And teacher quality, he found, was highly affected by the verbal skills of teachers. So those are the two conclusions of the Coleman report. And that's how we should look at the data on the 50 years of achievement. Going to the next page, this is what Coleman is no longer with us, so I couldn't ask him directly. I did meet him once, though, but I couldn't ask him anymore. I asked him, we presumed this is what he would say from his report, from his writings, from speeches that I attended. I think Coleman would say that these changes made in these 50 years of reform may make schooling better, but they have not affected the major indicator, parental background, and maybe not the second, teacher quality. Therefore, these improvements will not likely significantly raise student achievement. So what he's saying is that we've been misdirecting our efforts, that we've been trying to bring about things that are important, that may help schooling, but they're not going to deal with the fundamental problems of children coming to school with low SESs, low socioeconomic backgrounds, not being able to break out of that in order to do well in life. That's the dilemma. And that we have to pay much more attention to teacher quality. So the next slide, I don't think you should criticize unless you offer a remedy. So my remedy would be this. We should deal with parental background, but we should deal with it in this way. These are trying to ameliorate the effects of low SES. I don't know if it helps you visually, but it helps me. If you look at two large circles, you'll see one filled to the top. And you look at the other one, it has a little bit at the bottom, and the rest is empty. Well, the first one is affluent parents, high SES, and that means that the children of those parents have been mentally stimulated since they were born. First of all, even before that, the mother probably had a good pregnancy and all sorts of care. But once the child was born, parents in the upper classes talk to their children. Their children wind up with much broader vocabularies than children middle class, lower class. They give the children a mental stimulation through museum visits, through other visits. They're constantly talking to them, on to them. They ask for their cooperation of what penalties should kids pay for doing wrong. They don't impose it on them. All these advantages. And then you look at the poor kids, and there's a little bit on the bottom of the circle. Well, you have to make up for part of that in order for that kid to have any chance in life. Now, you can't make up for it all, because a lot of this is just economically driven. But you have to make up for a good part of it. And the way you can do that is, first of all, through parental engagement. There are proven parental engagement programs that raise student achievement and also motivate students so that they can do better in college, in high school, and go on to college. And secondly, we have to have preschool programs that are high quality, after-school programs, and summer programs of high quality. And these cannot be flimsy programs. They have to be programs that are ongoing, well-funded, with good teachers. If we don't do that and make a long-term commitment to that, we're not going to have much effect on this. SESs will be what they will be, which would mean condemning kids to their parents' status. If we're going to have a better country, we're going to have to shake that. The second thing I would do was teacher quality. I would take Coleman's findings and say that teaching profession should be made into a true profession, and that the people I think who can do it are governors, because they are at the level where they can call together all the people within a state that have an influence on teacher training and try to get them to agree on improvements. I would offer as the first step that you talk about whether it's possible to get better paid, smart teachers. Teachers with high verbal abilities, teachers with high cognitive skills. Those seem to be the teachers that turn out to be the best. But they have to have all sorts of other attitudes, attributes, and that has to be living conditions and so on. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's something that should be incorporated into a general package. So that's what I conclude. The conclusions are that you had a question, which is, why do a majority of Americans think schools today are worse than they intended? The answer, school reforms were not properly targeted on parental background and teacher quality. That's it. Let me conclude. So for 50 years, Coleman's findings have been challenged. In fact, Harvard had a group that met every Monday morning, I think, in their cafeteria and tried to poke holes in Coleman's findings. Other groups have too, liberals and conservatives. But Coleman's findings have been challenged, but nobody has been able to prove him wrong, which means that parental background does have the power that he says it has. And it also has not been proven wrong on teachers. So schools should try to do this. They should try to have programs that engage parents, but they also should try to have programs that are high-quality preschool, high-quality after-school, high-quality summer programs. And this means you have to make a real commitment over the years. You have to make it a long-term project so that it's not a few years and then they have to compete for funds and they can't get funding and they go out of business. It has to be something that's integral to schooling. And that will help fill up that circle so that the kid has more experiences and more things to grow on than before. But let me say one last word about this. I'll talk about something else too. With this, the schools are being asked to solve society's economic problems, solve society's social problems, and even health problems. When AIDS was an epidemic, schools had to teach about AIDS. So what's going to happen is that schools will be overburdened. They cannot solve these problems. These problems are matters for presidents, Congress, legislatures, governors. They're the ones who ought to be creating a fairer society, a society that shares benefits and prosperity instead of having it all congeal up to the top. They ought to be working to have a society where somebody can get job training and get a better job, where the focus is on creating jobs for people, creating good jobs, and for everybody, not for a select elite. You have to broaden our reform. This is the way the schools are going to become better, if society becomes better. But if society continues down the path of greater wage inequalities, fewer services, schools can't solve that. Those are problems that were created by presidents and congresses and governors, and they're the ones who have to be corrected. So that's why I say school reform has been oversold. School reform cannot change the unemployment rate in the country. School reform cannot change the tax rate in the country, who gets taxed and who doesn't. But school educators, school reform people, to spend half their time in schools trying to change that, to make schools better, but then half their time trying to make society better. If they don't, I won't say they're wasting their effort, but you're not going to see great efforts in the schools. You can have the prettiest, most efficient school you want, but if kids have the heavy weight on their backs of low SESs, they're not going to do well in school. And we would have miscalculated again and spent our time and money on the wrong things. So I hope that's my message. Not a nice message necessarily, but let me add one thing. I talked to the school administrators and so on, and this is not a time you'd want to be a school administrator. Within 2 months, they have to figure out whether schools are going to open and how they're going to open. And they face three really challenging topics. One is that there's a health crisis because of the virus, which means that they have to give more space to kids. And many of these schools are overcrowded already. So are they going to educate half the kids in the school building and then send the other half home? Are they going to rotate? What are they going to do? The school administrators also face an education crisis. Namely, the remedy for last year was that there would be computer-based learning. Well, poor kids and older men, but poor kids do not do well on computers and do not have access to computers. And so we're going to find that computer-based learning follows the same SES pattern as the rest of education. That the kids who do well already have done well, the kids who do bad are the kids who have already done bad. And then the third crisis schools face, as if this wasn't enough, was that the states do not have enough revenue to keep everybody on board. And so the states may eliminate 5 to 20% of their teachers unless the federal government steps in. So in the midst of these crises, here I come along waving my little blue book and saying you have to change yourself. Well, I know that's not going to happen right away. So I would urge that before the administrators go in and make all these decisions on how to go back to school, that they ask themselves, are the decisions we make today going to make it easier for kids with low SESs to do well in school? Are we countering the effects of inequality in schools? And I asked them and ask a second question, which is what we did today. Is it going to bring about better teachers? Is it going to bring about teachers that are better paid, that are smarter teachers? Have we improved the quality of the teaching force? Those are the questions they should ask. And I would hope they give the right answers, which is yes. If they give answers that say we don't know or we don't care, we're going to have the same schools as we have now. And so I ask that they at least give that attention to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. We really appreciate your presentation. And we have a number of questions coming in. And I did want to just start off by acknowledging the very tough times that we are facing with the coronavirus. As you mentioned, economic havoc, and also continued racial injustice. And I wonder if you have any additional comments and thoughts about what the impact of all of these challenges at the same time will have on education policy.
Well, it'll have an effect on the bars. I think you'll have a lot more people go to bars when they're open. But in terms of education policy, schools are overwhelmed. But I think this has to be answered in light of the riots. Riots are not new in the United States for racial injustice. The whole city was burned down in Oklahoma in the 1920s because of racial injustice and protests. And so these are not new things in our history. The problem is that when they break out, after people feel frustrated, and then illegal things occur, and people should go to jail for the illegal looting and so on, then society mounts one or two little programs to try to take care of the rest of the poor kids and have them do better in life. And then the funding disappears after a couple of years. I think they have to take a lesson from my book, which is that if you want to address this issue, which is a deep-rooted issue in the United States, you have to have a consistent program, well-funded, with good teachers, and maintain that program for years. It can't be an ancillary program. It has to be part of schooling. So poor kids should have pre-school programs that are good, should have after-school programs that are good, should have summer programs that are good. That helps to make up the space in that circle. And they have to be integral so that they're funded. They're not add-ons. They're just part of schooling. If they become part of schooling, and you're not going to have effects in 1 year or 2 years, if they become part of schooling in 10 years, 20 years, you will see an effect. So I think we have to think long-term, not short-term.
Thank you. Asking, can we restore the dignity of vocational education? And that the push turns a lot of students off. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
One of the chairmen I worked with was Carl Perkins from Kentucky, and he was the primemost champion of vocational education. And so I dealt with that issue for years. What happened was vocational education had an upturn, and then the general administrators and the superintendents and governors became interested in academic education. And so what happened was vocational education went down and academic education went up. And it was not the right thing to do to exclude vocational programs. They should be an integral part of education. But vocational education created part of its own problem, in that it used outdated equipment and it didn't keep its teachers up to date. So if there is to be job training in the schools, it has to be job training connected to industry so that the school doesn't have to buy all sorts of very expensive equipment. It has to be internships from the school to the business so kids get an idea of what's really demanded on the workplace. And it has to be with an acknowledgement, as you said, as the questionnaire said, that college is not for all, and that some kids just do better in vocational education. So vocational education, I think, will have its day. These things are cycles, and I think it's starting to come around again. But it'll have to come around again changed. It'll have to come around again as a better type of occupational training.
Great, thank you. Here's a question about parental backgrounds asking, how does school reform focus on parental backgrounds, and what are some specific measures schools could take to improve families' education and access to learning opportunities?
Well, compensatory education was provided through Title I for years. And the original concept of Title I of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, the federal law, the original concept from Johnson and the writers of that law was that the problem in American education was inequities, because some school districts had $1,000, other school districts had $500. And so they wanted to provide federal aid to even out the money between school districts. And that's what they thought they would get. Well, by the time things evolved and the program worked its way through the Department of Education, it became more and more focused on children with poverty and with problems in school. And so it became a focused program that those children should get the benefits of all the aid, not general children, not the budget of the school district. But that took a path where it became too rigid. And there were all sorts of audit problems, and administrators are very afraid of audits if they use the money the wrong way. And so it evolved into what we have today, which is that in many schools, I think half the schools are school-wide projects, which is an acronym for saying that they can use the money any way they want to. What we have today, I think, because of poor funding and the way the program evolved, we have Title I as a source of funding in a poor school. It's a source of funding for textbooks, or a source of funding for equipment, and a source of funding for hiring one teacher for a short period of time. And it's not dealing with the structural problems with enough force, with enough money to do something to bring about real change. And so if we are going to deal with the after effects of SES, we have to make a commitment to find the best way to deal with this so that it doesn't become just another little pot on the side, but that it's central to helping schools. And we have to do it in a way that commits a substantial amount of money to it. And then we will have a chance to help kids.
Thanks, Jack. We have a question about, we talk a lot about helping students to be successful. How would you describe success for a school-aged child?
Well, the coin of the realm has turned out to be test scores. And you can't ignore that. In fact, when I was head of this think tank, we convened a group, and assessment experts and others, and we wrestled with the fact, I said, give us something that isn't test scores. And they went through all sorts of deliberations, and we couldn't find anything. So tests are there, and we have to live with tests. I wish there were also scores for athletic ability, scores for artistic ability, scores for other intelligences. We've come to understand that the intellectual intelligence, the abstraction intelligence, is only good for some people, that other people have different types of intelligence. But we are geared towards an academic view of intelligence, which is that the ultimate objective is that you become a professor and write papers and deal with 5 kids in the graduate program. That's the ultimate way schooling is going. Instead of realizing that kids have to get real jobs, and they have to pay off their student loans, and they have to get involved in the economy. So I would hope that there would be a broadening of indicia of success in school. But it'll take a while to do, because there's this belief that test scores are real and other things are not. And that's not true. Frequently, the test is only as good as the money put behind it. And so I was on the board of the Education Testing Service for years. And what happened was that the states would come in and say, we want to test. And they would say, we only want to spend $100,000. So ETS, which had a plethora of excellent tests, tried to sell them a better test. And they said, I'm sorry, we only had that much money. So they got what they paid for. And that's judging children's progress now. So if we're going to use tests, we should use them in the right way, which is they should be big tests. They should be tests geared towards a particular objective, and they should the results should be used in context.
Do you see, Jack, any states leading the way in advancing the types of reforms you're suggesting? And if so, which ones and in what ways that are most worth noting?
Well, part of the problem is that chief state school officers, the ones who are responsible for the whole system of education within a state, have turned over considerably in the last 10, 20 years, because the post has become more political. And the Republicans have shifted to becoming dominant at the state level. They control 2/3 of the states, whereas in the 1960s and 70s, the Democrats controlled 2/3 of the states. So they reflect their values. And their values are that there should be tax cuts instead of increases for education. So many states are underfunded because the money has disappeared through tax cuts. And so you can't have many stellar states if you have underfunded schools. My first in California was chairman of the State Board of Education for both the 2 terms Governor Brown was governor. And Mike Hurst did a very good job. I think California is a leader in changing schools. What they tried to do was to move decision-making down to the local level and be fair in the distribution of money so that local people would have a chance to decide how the money is to be used. It's yet to be evaluated and shown to be right. But I think that is the direction to move in, to find what's really important and then give freedom to people with other things. So I'd point to California. I'd point to Massachusetts. Massachusetts has had a decades-long effort to improve its schools. Its schools are among the top in the country. If Massachusetts isn't number 1, certainly number 2. And so I think those are 2 good examples.
Great, thank you. Talking about success, just to a question, one category you did not touch upon is social-emotional learning. And the person sending the question wonders what your thoughts are on this and how social-emotional intelligence plays into education reforms.
Well, I'm an old guy. I've been around a lot. And what I've seen over the years is that educators propose strategies that seem a little flighty to politicians. This, to a Republican conservative, would seem to say that you're not holding kids to discipline, not holding them to working hard. You're making excuses for them because of their social background or their economic background. I think that's an unfair criticism because I think the idea in its core is right, that you have to be aware of kids and whether they're ready for school, whether they need to be prepared for school, their emotional feelings. They should be incorporated. But I'll tell you, I've seen it already in some articles in Education Week. It's stirring up people on the other side. And they look for things like this. So I wish you could achieve the core that's being proposed, but do it in a different way, with different language. But we will see. Maybe this one will get by. But it's a needed change because it does look at the whole child instead of the child as a test taker.
Thank you, Jack. Yeah, and I think we would agree that it is important to look at the whole child. What do you think is the role of schools to help families become activist citizens and challenge inequities and racial bias?
I shouldn't tell the story, but my mother and father were driving with my youngest sister. She was a late-in-life child. My father was a policeman in Chicago. My mother stayed at home. And my father used a word he shouldn't have used about somebody on the street. And my little sister, who was about 10 years old, said to him, "Daddy, you shouldn't have used that word. That's a prejudice word." My father said, "God damn, Ma, what did you do in bringing up these kids as liberals?" So Chicago policemen are difficult to deal with sometimes. But of course it's the role of parents to teach their kids that the United States is changing, but to teach their kids the fundamental value that everybody's the same. The scientists tell us that 2% of our bodies are different. Other than that, we're the same creature. And why we erect these barriers between us, I don't understand. We eat the same, we drink the same, sleep the same. Racial discrimination is evil, and it should be eliminated. But so is other discrimination. And so parents obviously have a role. I don't know whether parents realize that, but the parents say, especially what they say at the dinner table, is being absorbed by their kids. And so when they use certain names, the kids just absorb those names and repeat them in public. And so the burden on parents is heavy. They should help for us to have a safer, fairer society.
And just following up on that comment, Jack, we have a question or comment that notes, I'm sorry, when you talk about parent background, this factor is largely in terms of economic status and inequality. You mentioned the value of parent engagement. How would you take advantage of their strengths, of parents' strengths and knowledge, especially in ethnically diverse schools?
Well, it would be wonderful if parents could be in the school, sharing their gifts with the kids. But unfortunately, the lower you go down the income level, the more people have to work. And so they're not available to go to school. I was thinking, we've learned a lot about computer-based stuff, and Zoom now is a way for teachers and parents to communicate without having to set a meeting and have everybody race to the meeting after work. It is a way to better communicate and do it more casually. So there are technological things that can be done, but unfortunately they may be more available to people with more money than to people with less money. I think some organizations have done work on this, and we cite those organizations in our book. There is a lot of evidence to show that these programs work, and I think it's a matter of making these programs better known to people so that they can be put into schools.
And there's a question that asks, can we construct a model of schooling that emphasizes academic achievement as well as preparation for work and participation in the civic life of the nation?
I think so. I think we can. But the question is important because it identifies different purposes. Academic, but it's employment and it's civic. Those are different purposes of education. And today the emphasis is being put on the academic leading to economic. And there is not that much emphasis on civil society, which is one of the reasons why kids did not score well in the recent NAEP results on civics, and why there's a lawsuit in Rhode Island that is suing the state for not teaching a kid who's been in the public schools for her whole career, not teaching her enough about civics so that she could be a good citizen. So schools have to be more balanced today. What's happened is that they've become tunnel viewed on producing higher test scores, and they have to broaden that scope.
And then there's a question around teacher unions. Could you discuss the impact of teacher unions on the schools?
Well, teachers, you have teachers unions in some states. You have teachers associations in other states. In a handful of states, teachers unions are quite strong. But in much of the country, you don't have strong teachers unions, you have associations. And the ironical thing is that I know that people criticize teachers unions, but if you look at where they're strongest, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, you find the kids do better in school. I'm not saying they do better because of unions, but the idea that unions are the source of the problem, I think should be called into question. Unions were created to protect teachers from arbitrary actions by administrators, and this was in the early part of the 19th century, 20th century. And teachers felt that when they didn't have protection, administrators would make them do all sorts of things that weren't contemplated in their job description. And so they sought protection, and they sought better wages. And this was necessary because at the time, most teachers were women, most teachers were people of color, because they couldn't get jobs elsewhere. And so they felt they needed protection against the male administrators. But unions are very relevant today. The AFT is a very vibrant, intellectually stimulating organization. They're willing to talk about things, they're willing to document things, they're willing to look differently at things. It's a good organization. The NEA is so big that they do many good things, but they're such a large organization, it's hard for them to concentrate, it seems, on a couple of things. So the unions, I know on TV, this is what the worst thing. On TV, what you see, especially in the big cities, is a fight between people of color who are in the unions and the school board and the political leaders who are probably not people of color. And you have these harsh statements made back and forth, and these gross debates occur. And that's on TV at night. And what people see from that is that the unions are fighting all the time. They don't see the part of the teachers' personality is that the teachers spend most of the time in school, not with union affairs. So I don't think unions are the problem. I think unions, which were created to protect teachers, should make clear that the equal objective is to educate kids and protect kids. And if they find there's a conflict between those two goals, and the teacher who's being challenged is not educating kids well, I think the union should let that person defend themselves or let them go. So, and I think the union should be a little media smart and put on TV some better scenes than I'm putting on now, because it's corrosive. People watch TV and they generalize from those scenes. So that would be my advice.
Great. Thank you, Jack. In your conclusion, you state the notion that better schools will bring about a better economy should be turned on its head. A better economy may be the only way to bring about better schools. I wonder how hopeful you are at this time, given the economic crisis, about that comment.
Well, look at me, I'm a retired guy. I can write a book, but I can't change the world. I hope my book is bought so that other people will read it and see whether it's accurate and fight for what I'm saying. But I'm primarily concerned that people think, and they think differently. For people who are trying to improve education today, it's a tough road with all these crises. But I have a little flag they should wave, which is, are we doing today going to be what's good for kids who are not well-off kids? Is it good for quality of teaching? Because what I've found over time is that short-term policies that are made to deal with the crisis, like the crises administrators are facing, short-term policies tend to become long-term policies, and long-term policies are very hard to change. And so I would ask at the opening of this reconstitution of schools, people ask, is what we're going to do helping people, kids at the low end of SES and at the middle end, the middle part, and is going to be the improvement of teachers.
And just related to that, we have another comment or question. As we prepare to return to school in August, what's the single most important message we can take back to our administration to address students with lower SES?
Well, I'm not sure many schools are going to open. The Education Week had an article saying that 2/3 of educators prefer no opening of schools. And some schools may not open until January. And I think they're hoping for a vaccine. Well, you just have to do the best you can. What's going to happen, I think, is that kids are going to be rotated. So some will be in school part of the time, some will be at home part of the time, which creates another problem, which is who's watching the kids at home when both parents are working. But that'll probably be what happens. They're going to have to find some way to use computer-based learning more intelligently, and maybe double up on the assistance to kids who don't know how to use a computer, while lightening up on kids who do know it. They're going with reducing the force. That's going to be tricky because contracts, I think, generally protect those who have the longest longevity, but they may not be the most effective teachers. So that's going to be a struggle. You don't want to be an administrator today. They're all going to come out with gray hair and maybe a tick or two from nerves. It's going to be quite a struggle for them. My heart is with them. I know these people want to do the right thing, but Lordy Lord, what are they going to do when their buildings are already crowded, when they don't have money, and when they have fewer teachers? But people have said you don't let an emergency go by unused. This may be the time to reconfigure teaching. You know, what's happened in other industries like the pharmacies and medical industry is that there's a highly trained person in charge, and then they use people who are like physicians' assistants or drug personnel that cut up the drugs. They use them. So the pharmacist doesn't do it all. People at different levels do much of the work. Now that is creating jobs for people, but it's not the top jobs and it's not the top pay. But corporations seem to think that that's a better mix. Rather than having 10 pharmacists, they can have pharmaceutical aides and one pharmacist. Maybe in education we have to think a little that way. Should there be master teachers who have young teachers out of schools of education who can help them, and the master teacher would educate those people? Maybe there's different ways of looking at things. The unions may be opposed to that. But I think we're in Chicago. They had rioting on Michigan Avenue. and now all those buildings are boarded up. And we're wondering whether they're thinking of whether to reopen because marketing is moving away from stores to Amazon and the internet. And so they're thinking, should they reopen? Well, the schools should think the same thing. Should they reopen the way they were? Isn't there something we've learned about education that they can incorporate into these new schools, the new arrangements? And I think what we've learned is they have to pay much more attention to kids at the bottom and the middle. And they have to get better teachers than they have now.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to pose one final question, which is a what-if, slightly blue sky thinking question. Assuming an administration change in January 2021, and assuming you accept an appointment as Secretary of Education, what would be your first actions?
Well, I hope I'm not that foolish, and I hope the White House isn't even foolisher. But my first action would be to, two first actions. One is I would walk the corridors and meet with everybody in the department, which is what Dick Riley did when he was secretary. And I talk to people about what's real, what are the problems, what aren't the problems. Then I would make an attempt to go out and talk to school superintendents, and I would try to take a year to do that. Now, I don't know if that would be possible because you have to work in Washington, but I think you have to listen to people. I think the secretaries of education, especially the last couple, have not listened to people. They have their ideas, and they don't want people to turn them. They don't want to listen to any other point of view. I don't think you should start out that way. I think you should start out listening to people and then come to a point of view. But I'm very cognizant of politics. A president, when he's elected, this will probably be he, and when he has Congress on his side, has about a year to enact something. And generally it's one major priority, possibly two major priorities, no, not three priorities. And so you don't have time. So a president, when he gets inaugurated, has to be sure that the next day he's going to propose something major and he's going to get it through before he's done in 2 years. That's the length of the Congress. And if you wait until the end of the 2 years, you probably aren't going to get anything enacted. There's a rhythm of these things. Most things are enacted in the first year of a new Congress, or at least they're put on their way. Most things are enacted in the first years at the end of the term because they're trying to clean everything up. So you have to be aware of the political agenda as well as the policy agenda.
Great, thank you, Jack. And unfortunately, we are out of time at the moment. As a reminder, the event recording will be available on Jack's website, which is jackjenningsdc.com, and also AYPF's website, aypf.org. And don't forget to get your copy of Fatigued by School Reform, which is available on Amazon. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and we wish you a very pleasant day.